Let's chat about how you can build better worlds in D&D 5e, and stay tuned for a cool new Kickstarter from our friends at Gooey Cube. Not enough is often said about how absolutely daunting world building can be. It's hard to know where to start, and I myself am no stranger to analysis paralysis. So I've compiled everything I've learned about building fantasy worlds for D&D and boiled it down into 3 main aspects that you can use to create more evocative adventures more easily. I call them the 3 Gs: genre, geography, and most importantly, Greg. Yes, Greg. You may choose to believe that I've retroactively changed the name of one of these aspects so I could collectively call them the 3 Gs. But I can assure you, it's always been this way. I would never alter such hallowed doctrine behind the scenes without you knowing, unless I were trying to make a nuanced point about the very nature of world building for your D&D games. But we'll get to that later. For right now, let's focus on genre since it's probably the aspect you're most familiar with. You should begin by asking yourself, what kind of fantasy world are you keen on making? Is it a high fantasy adventure where magic exists around every corner as you sail across a sea of stars? Is it a low fantasy world grounded in gritty realism where magical ability is seen as an anomaly? Or is it something in between? More than the other 2 Gs we'll talk about, your genre can be mostly simplified into a series of spectrums beginning with high fantasy versus low fantasy, like in the example we just made. You can also try to lock down your concept on a spectrum of past, present, and future, as in the case of medieval fantasy versus sci-fi, or unknown versus known as it relates to how well explored your setting is. It's easy to go on and on down this rabbit hole as you refine the idea that acts as a solid foundation for your world, and really, you should. Understanding what renders your setting unique, or conversely, familiar, will go a long way in motivating the rest of your fantasy world and generating interest from your players around the table. In this stage, you should be operating on more of a general vibe and less on harder specific details that your players will be interacting with directly. As a general rule of thumb, the genre of your world is something more often felt than it is talked about or even seen. For example, a post-apocalyptic world where magic pours in from other planes of raw elemental energy is a highly evocative idea that will likely inspire your players to seek out more information about how it all works. But they'll be interacting with places and people rather than the actual idea. And you shouldn't feel like your idea has to be anything groundbreaking either. While many writers and world builders frown upon using Tolkien's standard fantasy as a base for your games, there's not really anything wrong with that. Just be sure to spend some time adapting what you borrow from your various inspirations to fit into the big picture of your own creativity. Each one of us brings a personal touch through our own lived experiences. Your beliefs and thoughts and emotions are what drive you, and it should be what drives your world by extension. Well, that and magic, of course. But what is magic in the context of your world? You may have already decided on how prevalent it is, but how does it work and how does it affect the world at large? If you're playing D&D, you may even think that you've had this decision made for you already, but that doesn't have to be the case. Taking the rules and mechanics for D&D and applying them to a new magic system is a great way to immerse your players in something fresh and new, even if it isn't entirely necessary. The key takeaway here is that you can make anything your own at this stage. As overwhelming as that can be, it's likely why you got into homebrewing your own world in the first place. And I bet you already have some fantastic ideas. Magic itself is actually a strong parallel for what you're trying to do right now. It only exists with the right conditions that allow for a suspension of disbelief, just like creating a world for your players to explore. In order to achieve this suspension of disbelief, you need to strike a delicate balance between the familiar and the unfamiliar. People that see your magic trick need to understand that it defies what should be possible, but not so much that they immediately understand how the trick was performed. That sense of wonder is what'll keep them coming back for more. Likewise, when your players experience your world, they should be exposed bit by bit to the lore of your setting without you handing them a 10-page document detailing the world's history. Trust me, I've done it before and they'll never read it. And you shouldn't even be worried about those finer details yet. Remember, this is where I see most people getting bogged down. Expanding your world to every border and fleshing out every event of historical significance that makes your world interesting. In the words of Da Vinci, art is never finished, only abandoned. If you allow yourself to spin your wheels forever, you may never actually get to share your creation with anyone. So I suggest that you imagine your own life experiences here. How many places have you truly seen with your own eyes? How much do you really know about the planet that you live on? If your fantasy world is a mountainous iceberg, your players should only ever be exposed to the tip of it. The rest is for you. It's an old analogy that I like for visualizing what we're trying to do, but it still implies that you need to do all this work for just a small fraction of your world. So let's instead imagine that the iceberg is hollow underneath. If your players were to proverbially dunk their heads into the water to catch a glimpse, they'd see what they were looking for and then come back up for air. But you would only have to add more detail below the surface later. For example, if your players were to discover that a neighboring country was secretly controlled by a shadow government of subterranean lizard people, that's likely all they would need to find out in that moment. They wouldn't need to know that the lizard people all have names that start with the letter Z, or that lizard women in your world have boobs despite not being mammals. That's all information that they might get later as they research this secret cult of reptiles and as you build out more information for the next time they decide to peek beyond the tip of the iceberg. Really, all you need to start playing is this genre, a surface level understanding of your world, and maybe one town or city where the adventure begins. But if even that seems a bit too daunting, you'll love this new Kickstarter from Gooey Cube that goes live today. Usually this is the part where I'd throw some cool green screen action sequences in your face to try and convince you to back this incredible project, but even that would be a disservice to the mountain of work that has gone into it already. Seriously, if you're a fan of excellent writing and engaging adventures, you need to check this out. The Tomb of Gyzaengaxx pays homage to D&D legends, including Gyzaengaxx himself, and has even been co-authored by Luke Gyzaengaxx and Gaxworks. This mega adventure and campaign has tons of immersive handouts included and loads of Easter eggs that combine for an effortlessly evocative play experience for both you and your players. Truly, our friends over at Gooey Cube deserve all the support in the world on this Kickstarter. They're making the iceberg for you here, and I've been really impressed with their work in the past as well. So take a moment to follow the link in the description and back the Kickstarter today. Now it's about time that we move on to the next of our 3 Gs, geography. And the most important part of geography, rivers don't split. Just kidding. They don't split in our world. If they split in yours, who gives a shit? Don't let those silly earthlings tell you how your world works. That in mind, the geography of your world, no matter what it looks like, should have a large effect on the cultures and communities and creatures living on top of it. As you craft new locations for your players to explore, consider what is necessary for life to exist. Many people will tell you that civilization can only thrive near sources of fresh water like ponds and streams, but maybe magic solves that problem for you. George Lucas solved this problem by inventing moisture farmers on Tatooine. He didn't make the story revolve around this need for water or the importance of moisture farmers in the desert landscape, but it grounds his space opera with a sense of realism. That is what we're most after here. And by utilizing this build-as-you-go approach that we mentioned earlier, you'll be able to dedicate some extra time to fleshing out these supporting details for each of your sessions. I once had a desert community living on the edge of a boiling sea that used kites to collect the resulting steam into small bottles that they'd use to sustain themselves. Others lived inside of a giant insect mound and refined moisture from the insects themselves. Water sources are just one example, and none of it was pivotal to the plot, but it allowed the players to believe in this location with all the further details that were never actually there. But some aspects of your world do weigh heavily into the plot and do require more rigid structure, namely politics and how they affect the immediate surroundings of your players. And yes, we're still talking about geography. Sure, monarchies and mountains are not the same thing, but I would challenge you to find any major way that these two ideas would influence your players differently. We aren't talking about the king in a monarchy. We're talking about the monarchy as a system in and of itself. We're starting to get more specific in our world building approach, but not so specific that the king is an actual dude. He's just an idea right now. And as an idea, he's flexible. Maybe he is a she. Maybe she is a group of people. Or maybe they are of religious order. In much the same way that the presence or absence of water might affect what the players see in a given location, the political landscape might influence this as well. Try your hand at creating forms of government alternative to the norm. Make a republic set in the medieval time period. Craft a culture where only the strongest rules within your sci-fi setting. And then let those governing factions influence their own domain without lore dumping all over your players. Then begin to imagine what role the gods and religions may play in your world and how that might influence cultures as well. The Dungeon Master's Guide actually has some pretty great source material for this if you need it. And with the culmination of these unique ideologies and physical landmarks, you will naturally gravitate to the center point of any good story and the pinnacle of geography: conflict. Conflict can be a war between nations, it can be a disagreement between two individuals, or it can even be a struggle of the Commonwealth against some oppressive overlord archetype. It is often said that peace is a temporary state between conflicts, and a world at total peace is a world of stagnation. If your players are not exposed to some central conflict or tension, then there had better be a compelling reason as to why. And if an age-old conflict threatens to tear apart space and time, you should still be asking the very same question: why? Most writers and world builders have some innate sense of the necessity of conflict in a good story. It's been ingrained in our psyche ever since Sam I Am refused to try green eggs and ham, even though we all knew for damn sure that he would like it. So even Dr. Seuss would likely agree that there is a natural tendency to include conflict in your story, regardless of nuance. So be careful not to oversimplify this. Two countries do not simply go to war for the fun of it, and the subjects of each territory do not wander onto the battlefield in blind obedience. Everyone thinks they're the good guys, and every good conflict has depth. So keep asking yourself why until you can plausibly see yourself taking up arms on either side of the battlefield, no matter the color of the banner. And maybe it's time for us to start imagining what banners might be waving in this imaginary battle. Finally, it's time to move on to Greg. Who is Greg, and why is he so much more important than plate tectonics, political structures, and literal gods? Well, Greg is who your players will experience your entire world through. Greg is simultaneously the king of a country, the dock worker with a secret, the troll under the bridge, and even the humble innkeeper. Greg is what you should focus on the most when building your world. When your players approach any of these individuals in-game, even the big bad evil guy, their suspension of disbelief will largely rely on how your NPCs react to current events, history, and even the player characters themselves. All of the flowery descriptions and captivating plots in the world will never make up for a single bad Greg. Plan your sessions with consideration for the people that live in your world. Give them interesting traits, motivations, and aspirations, and use the rest of your world to inform their opinions on it. The dock worker may smuggle weapons through the city port in order to strengthen the ranks of a much larger organization that he aspires to join himself after the promise of riches beyond his wildest dreams. A troll under the bridge is a common trope, but maybe he lives there after being forced from his home by another more vile creature. He might resent the villagers for misunderstanding him and his hideous appearance, but he means them no harm. The innkeeper might secretly resent the current war after losing a son or daughter in the fighting, a story they might share if you ask about the right scars or his missing arm. All of these people are Greg, and each will offer your players a different insight into the details of your world as they unknowingly digest bits and pieces of that 10-page document that you decided to keep to yourself. And then, in the midst of these conflicts and characters, story happens. Your players will naturally learn of the evil wizard in the bog, the tyrant king in his castle, or the terrible dragon of the high peaks. And they'll likely involve themselves to some degree. But we're still missing something here. A very vital something. I hear dungeon masters all the time complain about a lack of interest from their players, even after all of this work, and there's a simple reason for that. You've forgotten the most important Gregs of all, the player's characters. These Gregs breathe the same air and walk the same streets as the others. Why shouldn't you consider them in your world building? During your session 0, you're running one of those, right? Take the time to speak with each of your players about their character and develop their connections to your world and the people in it. Intertwine the backstories of your party with the main plot so that they actively seek out your clues and quest lines. Allow those bonds to expand and contract in ways that breathe life into your story, and you'll never have that problem again. Though I really want to stress this, you will eventually mess up. Inevitably, a troublesome Greg will say something that doesn't make sense or give your players the wrong impression. This is where things come full circle from that little clue I left you at the beginning of the video. When you mess up, your players will rarely be aware of it. So long as they're fairly immersed, it'll most often make them wonder how what you did fits with the overarching plot, rather than if you dropped the ball or not. My advice here is to let it go, and take some time before the next session to rework your plans behind the scenes. I don't think I've ever retconned anything, and I don't plan to start anytime soon. And neither should you. You'll eventually find that, surprisingly, your favorite moments and world-building elements will actually stem from these mistakes and the player's creativity as well. After all, you may have built the world, but they're actively shaping it along with you. With that mindset and the right prep, you're sure to run the most memorable games with a table full of engaged players. Just make sure you aren't confusing them during the session by watching this video next. Now, go out there and make some chaos.